Hey all, today I thought a really interesting topic might be my personal experience with the Chinese language. Since I've been living in China for quite some time, I use Chinese every day, and it's really important to my life and it shapes my life in many ways, and yet it's still a great challenge for me. The first time I was ever in China was when I was 25 years old. At that time, I didn't know any Chinese except that I learned the word ni hao, which means hello. I learned that many, many years ago. I'd also at one point seen the word Zhongguo written, that means China, but I didn't know how to pronounce it correctly at the time. So I came in with almost no understanding of Chinese. And so when I arrived in China all those years ago, I was in for quite a plunge into this language. One of the first things I remember noticing was the name of the city I was in at the time I first arrived, Beijing, and how its pronunciation was quite distinctive, how the second syllable was held out strong and long. The second syllable, I figured out the reason for this later, was that Chinese is a tonal language, that you must say that character like this. Jing. If you were to say Jing or Jing, that would be wrong. The city's name sounds like Beijing. And that sounded very distinctive to me at the time. This is a difficulty that many non-Chinese speakers have with Chinese, is distinguishing these tones, like the difference between ma, which means horse, or ma, which means to scold. So if you say it wrong, if you say ma for horse, someone will ma you. They will scold you. Using tones was very difficult for me at first, and it often is difficult for people whose native languages are European languages. One thing I did that helped me with this is that I would use hand motions to simulate the rise and fall of tones. Like this, if I was trying to say ma, I'd be like ma. And if I wanted to say ma, I'd be like ma. And if I wanted to say ma, I'd be like ma. And then if I wanted to say ma, I'd be like ma. I got some funny looks from people as I was waving my hands while trying to talk to them, but it really did help me to learn the tones. Another thing that I got into very quickly was learning Chinese characters. During that initial stay in Beijing, I started noticing a pair of characters that would appear together very often and began to wonder what they meant. Somehow these characters stood out to me, and eventually I got a guess about what they meant. I noticed that when they appeared and there was in a phrase and there was an English translation, the English translation would include the word Beijing in it. And I guessed correctly, as it turned out, that those two characters meant Beijing. I had a very strange way of remembering how these characters looked, and that way even allowed me to ultimately write it on paper, crudely but legibly. Chinese speakers will probably think this is pretty funny, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you. The first character, Bei, I remembered as a backward K next to a frontward T. And if that's amusing enough, the second character, Jing, that was a little Cantonese pronunciation there, probably like a Jing, right? That one I remembered as a television set on a tripod wearing a hat. Yes, feel free to laugh. It's a strange way to remember things, but it worked. I could recognize them, I could write them, and I started to learn other ones, mostly names of cities at first. I learned to write Shanghai, I learned to write Guangzhou. Soon after my short time in Beijing, I was in Chengdu. I learned how to write that name. By the end of the trip, I could recognize a few characters, but I did easily get confused. Like a lot of people, I easily confused the characters ren, which means person, with ru, which means enter. just because they look so similar and because they're both pretty commonly encountered. So by the end of that first trip to China, I had achieved quite a feat. I could go up to vendors and could say, 我要一瓶水, which means I want a bottle of water, while waving my hands, exactly like I just showed, in an attempt to get the tones to sound passable. Yeah, it was a start, but I'd gotten enough of a taste for the language by then that I decided when I came back to California to enroll in a first-year Chinese class at my university, even though that was an undergrad course and I was a grad student. So I ended up spending loads of time that I should have been spending writing my master's thesis, learning a language for which I was getting no credit. And Chinese was hard. I had already learned German pretty well by that time and never found it all that difficult, but Chinese was another matter completely because there were very few words that were similar, unlike in German, because the tones were still difficult and my hand motions could only get me so far, and mostly just because of all the Chinese characters to learn, about a dozen a week. I remember making flashcards and carrying them around with me to practice whenever I was stuck waiting in line at the DMV or wherever. Eventually, that year at university ended, I got my master's degree, and I finally finished that master's thesis. And about a year later is when I moved to China full time. And since then, learning Chinese has mostly been a slow absorption process. I haven't had formal study of the language since then, but being surrounded by written Chinese has allowed me to slowly increase my ability to read and increase the number of Chinese characters I can read. I really don't know how many that is now. I lost count a long time ago. Modern smartphones have also helped a lot. Being able to get out a phone and if I see an unknown character, look it up in my phone, and then I know what it means. Whereas if I were still stuck on paper dictionaries, boy, that's not a lot of fun because they don't have an alphabetical order, so it can be really hard to find stuff in a paper dictionary. Reading Chinese is still really difficult for me, though. If I get a newspaper, I can usually figure out what the story is about, but the finer details are very hard for me to figure out. Signage is easier. I can usually get around by reading signage just fine, even if there's no English signage, just because signage tends to come in very simple, mostly just nouns, place names, and occasionally like little very simple verb phrases. You may have observed on my previous videos that I often read signs during the course of at the various places I go to. Conversationally speaking, I can hold basic conversations about familiar topics most of the time, but I sometimes still struggle with vocabulary. Vocabulary is quite difficult for me in Chinese. Unlike in German, where advanced vocabulary is often very similar to English, you just don't get that help in Chinese. I certainly can't carry on complicated discussions about my professional life or about politics or anything like that. Then again, it's not a great idea usually to talk about politics in China, so maybe that's just as well. I can handle some basic things like buying stuff or getting directions without much trouble most of the time. So I have enough Chinese to live my basic life. My wife and I primarily speak English to each other, but we text in a mix of English and Chinese. Chinese is a fascinating language, and I could talk about it for hours. I probably will make more videos about it, my experience learning Chinese in the future. I hope you enjoyed this one, where I talk about my initial experiences learning Chinese and how my experience has gone on since that time. If you did enjoy it and you'd like to see more and know more about my experiences here in China, this would be a great time to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye!